Hello, yes, this is the HVAC School Podcast. This is a short episode. This short episode is about POE and mineral oil, and yes, I am driving into work this morning. You may hear a little sleep still in my voice, but never fear, I'm sharp when it comes to the topic of POE versus mineral oil, and I'm also sharp when it comes to the topic of our sponsors, which I'm going to name now, NAVAC and NAVACglobal.com. You can find NAVAC vacuums by going to TrueTechTools.com. Use the offer code GetSchooled for a great discount. Also want to mention Carrier and Carrier.com. AirOasis, find out about the AirOasis bipolar and nanos, where you can get them, the prices, all that stuff by filling out a form at aeroasis.com/go. That's aeroasis.com/go. And then finally, Refrigeration Technologies at refrigtech.com. They make all kinds of great cleaners and other products like Nylog. If you haven't used Nylog on threaded refrigerant fittings before, then you are missing out on a good time, my friend. All right, so here we go. POE and mineral oil. What's the difference and why should you care? Now, first thing that I have to note here is that for those of us who are nerds in the business, that's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about is POE versus mineral oil. But you'd be surprised how many technicians and installers are out there today who really don't even know that there is a difference. They just think of refrigerant oil as being one thing. And obviously there are other types of refrigerant oils other than POE and mineral, but I'm just going to focus on those two because those are the most common ones that we see. And so let's first talk about mineral oil and what its advantages are. One of the advantages of mineral oil is that it's very stable. Mineral oil there is some affinity for moisture. For example, if you think of vacuum pump oil is heavily refined mineral oil, and we know that vacuum pump oil does have a hygroscopic property, which means that it does have a property to absorb moisture. But regular refrigerant oil that we have in a typical old school AC system, say an R22 or an R12 system, while it can absorb some moisture, it doesn't have near the hygroscopicity, I don't know if that's a word, the hygroscopic properties, the water absorbing properties of POE oil. Also, mineral oil, just again, like I mentioned, it's just very stable. It's oil, it's what it is. It absorbs some moisture, it gets cloudy, but it doesn't change what it is. It's just mineral oil. It doesn't cause as many problems in the system, other than mineral oil does have this nasty property of not being very well carried by the refrigerant. Now with old R22, R12, older refrigerants, they would carry the mineral oil through the system by maintaining proper refrigerant velocity. So you would, when you were designing the piping, say on a refrigeration unit or on an air conditioner, you had to think a lot about making sure that you maintained your refrigerant velocity. And so pipe size was a really important consideration, and refrigerant line pitch was an important consideration, and trapping, things like that. Those are all important when you have mineral oil, because mineral oil, while it's a good oil and it's very stable, it's not carried through the system quite as easily as POE oil. Another thing is that mineral oil doesn't act as a solvent in the way that POE oil does. You'd have older systems and you would braze without flowing nitrogen, and you would notice that if you cut those lines open years later, that a lot of them would still have that carbon on the inside of the lines that accumulated when they were originally brazed. And so mineral oil is not really a solvent. It's an oil. It just travels through the system. It's an oil. But then we come up with POE oil, and the first thing we got to know about POE oil is that, of course, what does POE stand for? It stands for polyol ester. It's an ester oil, which I don't really know what that means, frankly. I'm not a chemist. But I do know what it does and why it matters. And the reason why we had to start using POE is that the newer refrigerants, the 4 series refrigerants especially, so R410A and R407C, anything that starts with a 4, which a lot of our modern blends have that, they just didn't carry the mineral oil the way that the old single component refrigerants did, like R22 and R12. And so you'd run into these problems where oil would just kind of sit in the evaporator coil, or it wouldn't return back to the compressor, because the goal of oil is to keep it in the compressor. That's where we want it. We want it in the compressor. But coming out of the compressor, you have really high refrigerant velocities, and so that compressor over time will lose some of its oil. It'll just blow out some of its oil, let alone if you have a flood back or flooded start condition, and then you'll really start to lose a lot of oil as that oil foams and gets blown out of the compressor. So you have these circumstances where your oil gets out of the compressor, and if your refrigerant doesn't carry it back, if it doesn't have the properties necessary to help move that oil back to the system, well, then it gets stuck in all kinds of places. It gets stuck in the evaporator coil, it gets stuck in low points, causes all sorts of trouble, and eventually it can cause some real capacity problems and even issues with your readings. You'll start to have restrictions because your evaporator coil or your metering device gets full of oil. It's a major problem, and you can't use mineral oil with the 4 Series refrigerants for that reason. Again, that's refrigerants like 410A. So they had to come up with a new oil, and they came up with this polyol ester oil, the POE oil. And the POE oil has a really great property, which is that it is carried with the refrigerant. And some people get the idea that POE oil is only good with the 4 Series refrigerants. Now, POE oil works fine with R22 as well. In fact, you'll see sometimes if you replace a compressor that the new compressor may come with POE oil in it, and that's something you need to know because you're going to have to think about that. If you had mineral oil in the system before, you're going to want to know that the new compressor potentially could come with POE oil, even if it's a R22 compressor. So POE oil is a really good oil from the standpoint of being carried through the system. In fact, you'll notice that there's not nearly so many requirements for traps or pitching or a lot of that stuff that we used to have to think a lot about when we had mineral oil. We don't have to think as much about when you have POE oil because POE oil is carried with the refrigerant. And the term that's used for carrying the oil with the refrigerant is called miscibility. I think that's how you say it. Actually, I'm not sure. I read that word all the time, but I don't say it out loud. Now that I say it, I'm not sure that that's the right way of saying it. But miscibility is the oil miscible in the refrigerant, meaning it doesn't mix. Is it carried along with the refrigerant? POE is very miscible in most of our modern refrigerants. It's carried along very well. And so that's a good thing. The bad thing with POE is that POE is very reactive, and it also acts more so as a solvent than mineral oil did, which means that you could have an old system that previously had mineral oil in it, and then you put POE oil in it, and that POE oil scrubs the walls of that copper and picks up all that carbon and throws it into your expansion valve and into your line dryers and all that sort of stuff. So it causes some trouble from the solvency standpoint, the fact that it can scrub stuff off the walls of the inside of your system. And it also creates a little bit of trouble from the standpoint of moisture absorption. So if you had an old system, let's say, that you converted to POE oil or changed refrigerants and went to POE oil, or maybe an old line set that you put a new piece of equipment on, and that part of the equipment is wet, and it has some moisture in it, moisture bonded to the walls and moisture trapped in the oil and moisture here and moisture there and moisture everywhere. Well, POE oil is going to react with that moisture, and it's going to actually change its properties. So unlike mineral oil, where mineral oil will become cloudy and maybe a little globby with some water, but at the end of the day, even when it mixes with water, it's still going to be mineral oil. POE actually changes its properties and becomes acidic. This has been well discussed and documented, and just from a personal experience, I can tell you that I had many cases in the previous company that I used to work for where they would start up units wet. So the startup technician wouldn't pull a proper vacuum, maybe the installer ran the line set and jammed it through a water-filled chase with the ends uncapped or with plastic caps on the ends that were breached, and you had significant water in the system. And they would start these things with POE oil, and these things would blow the compressor, black oil everywhere within a matter of a couple days. I've seen it on several occasions. Now that's an extreme circumstance. We don't see that all the time, but to a smaller extent, even any amount of water, any amount of moisture, or I should say any significant amount of moisture that's left in the system, a drop of water, can greatly reduce the life of a system that contains POE oil. Again, many of you know this, but some of you may not. The other thing to think about is, and I know we're generally not a fan of additives or those sorts of things, but you do need to know, like for example, if you're using an acid scavenger or acid inhibiting product of some sort, acid neutralizing product, that different products, some of them work with POE oil and some of them work with mineral oil. So that's another thing to think about with POE and mineral. Now another thing that comes up a lot is when people make refrigerant retrofits. So they go from R22 to another option, whether it's 407C or 438A or whatever it is. A lot of people are concerned about, well, what's going to happen if I put that new refrigerant in with the old mineral oil? And the answer is that it's not good. It's not a good thing to put 4 Series refrigerants in with a mineral oil system. But a lot of people swear by adding in a little bit of POE oil, and that will help carry the mineral oil around the system. Early on, when POE oil first came out, there was all these, I'll call them urban legends, that if you mix mineral oil and POE oil, that somehow it would react and it would cause all this trouble. And what we found is that's not really the case. You don't want mineral oil in with POE oil because the mineral oil is just going to get stuck places. It's going to get stuck in the evaporator coil and low points, and it's going to cause issues with heat transfer and issues with restrictions. but it's not so much that mixing the POE oil and the mineral oil causes some sort of like terrible reaction or something. In fact, like I said, some people are actually adding small amounts of POE when they make retrofits, and I've even seen some documentation from some manufacturers, refrigerant manufacturers, that seems to say that's okay. But all this sort of dances in a gray area. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I tend to be one that I just prefer to use the refrigerant that's designed for the piece of equipment until the time comes to change the equipment to different equipment. Now, obviously, if you're working in the world of refrigeration, where you have to retrofit a whole parallel rack or something, you're not going to replace the whole rack. That would be ridiculous. So retrofits in those sorts of applications make a lot more sense. But also in large rack grocery store refrigeration, they also tend to take a lot more care when they make those conversions to remove the old oil and put in new oil and make sure to replace line dryers, so on and so forth. The different factors that can come in when you make that transition from mineral to POE. And again, there are other types of oils as well, but we're not going to gum up the works here this podcast. Just keep it simple. So that's it. Mineral oil is a good oil. It just tends to get stuck places, and you got to think a lot more about velocity and oil return and the type of refrigerant that it works with. POE oil is a great oil, but it acts as a solvent. It tends to grab contaminants and plug stuff up, and it also is very hygroscopic, which means that it really likes to grab moisture, and that can change it to an acid, which can cause all sorts of damage, which is why in modern air conditioning we talk so much more about flowing nitrogen while brazing and pulling really deep vacuums, because it does matter more than it used to. It always mattered, but it matters more than it used to now that we have POE oil. So when an old timer tells you they've been doing it 30 years and it never made a difference with them, well, they worked in a time before there was a lot of POE oil. So now the world has changed. I hope that helped. We'll talk to you next time on the HVAC School Podcast.